Hello, my name is Paul Gilbert, and I'm delighted to welcome Monica Worline to our Creating a Compassionate World series with the Foundation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Monica, who I met some years ago in California, and she's been really a pioneer in bringing compassion into the workplace. So Monica has a PhD in organizational psychology, and she is the co-author of the book Awakening Compassion at Work, along with Jane Dutton. As a core faculty member at the University of Michigan Center for Positive Organizations, she serves as faculty director for Engaged Learning and Innovation. She is co-founder and leads an idea incubator serving to bridge academics and organizations called Enlivened Work. So done some wonderful things, Monica, and tonight we're just wanting to look at compassion in relationship to work. So first of all, how did you get interested in compassionate work?
I think that the long story of my interest goes back to my childhood. My parents ran a family business, and there was always work conversation going on around our dinner table. And they were insurance agents. So here in the United States, they're the interface between the large insurance agency and the policyholder. And that really meant that people came to my parents' place of work at the worst moments, in some of the worst moments in their lives, when some tragedy had happened, a fire or a flood, or someone had been injured, or there was a car accident. And so the work that my parents did in large part was compassion work alongside the insurance business. And I didn't have the language to talk about it then, but I do think that I came to appreciate very deeply early in my life that almost any profession done with compassion can serve as a linchpin of a community. And I carried that lesson with me into my studies. And I had the serendipity to be at the University of Michigan doing a PhD when Peter Frost and Jane Dutton were just beginning to write about compassion and workplaces. And the idea deeply resonated with me, and I joined them as a senior doctoral student on their first project. And that launched us into a long period of working together and writing about compassion and work from lots of different angles.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, of course, the history of work has been pretty miserable. If you go back in history to certainly in this country and the people in the factories, 200 to 300 years ago and so forth. And it's only gradually that people have started to get their minds around that maybe work should be a place where we thrive rather than struggle. So I think, what you're doing is terrific. So what do you see as the main issues in bringing compassion into work?
Well, workplaces are still pretty terrible for a lot of people, so we don't want to sugarcoat them. They may be terrible in some different kinds of ways, but the foundations of capitalism don't give us a lot of reason to hope when profit-making organizations view profit as the sole reason for their existence. And even well-meaning profit-making organizations that try to invest in the well-being of people when their profit motive is challenged will disinvest quickly in the well-being of people. So I do think that there are deep reasons to be suspicious of compassion and work. And those are important to keep in mind in doing this line of research and doing training or teaching or trying to bring compassion into work organizations. Because people will have concerns about privacy and not sharing too much of themselves or the suffering in their lives outside of work with people in the workplace. And I think those concerns are very real. But because workplaces are such difficult places, I think it also means that they must be places of compassion, even when the leadership or the hierarchical running of the organization doesn't embrace that idea. People encountering the suffering of other people are also going to bring compassion often into the work environment. So what we've done in our research is sometimes to start with people's experience wherever they happen to sit in an organization and just learn about what makes it easier and more difficult to express and receive compassion in work environments. At other times, we've worked with leadership groups and people in positions of influence to try to talk about creating conditions that make it easier for people to be compassionate in work, and to create routines, training programs, conversational evaluation systems, and other kinds of ways that consider more of people's human condition as a part of how they conduct and are evaluated in their workplace. So yeah, that's at a high, there's much I could say, but I'll stop there at a high level.
Well, that's terrific. So, I mean, I think one of the things we find is trying to help people think about what compassion actually is, because there's so much floating about on the internet, isn't there, about it's kindness, like that. Yeah. But there's this real dedication to pay attention to people's suffering, people's need, and trying to work out how to be helpful to them. And that's the basis of compassion. And as you know, when you do that, people are more likely to be creative, they're more likely to be loyal, and so on and so on.
Yes.
So do you find that's a key issue of trying to help people in work and in positions of leadership to really understand what we are talking about here? We're not talking about just being a bit nice to people. It's a real fundamental challenge.
Yeah, I find that people in workplaces get nervous when the word suffering comes into the conversation. So I do find that talking about distress of various kinds and giving examples of what we mean is an important way to start the conversation. I do think that talking about what compassion is and distinguishing it from niceness and kindness and other kinds of buzzwords that come up all the time in these work organizations is an important thing to do. The other thing that I find as a barrier, and your work has helped me tremendously with this, and figuring out how to bring this into the conversation, is that almost instantaneously upon raising the idea that we should encounter one another's suffering and it will influence our work, people are very afraid. And leaders are very afraid. They don't feel that they have the tools or capacity to handle employees suffering. They often don't think that it's a part of their job, and they think that they could, put it into another part of the organization, like, oh, the human resource people deal with that, and it's not my job, right? Or they just feel afraid that even if they wanted to be a compassionate leader, that they would be taken advantage of. And these are things you have written about so eloquently. I often begin the conversation by talking about myths and realities of the trade-offs between compassion and performance. Because another big myth that most people will have just hearing this conversation, or if I speak on a plane to a neighbor seatmate about what I do in my work, they'll ask, well, if you're compassionate to people, don't they just perform less well? Or how do you hold them accountable for high performance if you're going to be compassionate to them? So starting with some of the myths and fears, and just allowing people a space to talk about those myths and fears as a starting point before we really get to anything else we might do about it, I find a helpful beginning.
That's such an important point you make, isn't it? That the myths and fears really do get in the way. And, the basis of compassion is courage and wisdom. People kind of floats past people, doesn't it, really? So that's a really important point that you're making, that in order to work with organizations and bring compassion into the workplace, there is quite a lot of demystifying that you have to do.
Yes. And, I think that for many kinds of organizations, the global pandemic and the lockdown situations, and for people that may have changed their mode of working to use computers more or to work from home at times, that all illuminated something that we already had an angle into about how much suffering there really is in work organizations, and the variety of sources of suffering. So some sources of suffering are more easy for organizations to talk about than others. And it has been, typically in our work, we see that suffering that originates in, say, the illness of a child or the loss of a child can be very quickly embraced, and community building and care can be expressed for that form of suffering. But if the suffering has to do with forms of mental illness or emotional distress, or if the suffering has to do with financial difficulty, that easily gets into that same position I was talking about, where the work organizations and leaders in work organizations say, that's not our job. It's not our work to help people manage their money, or to help people have enough to eat, or to help people handle their mental illness. And that's really getting challenged. The illumination of the extent of suffering in work is challenging the idea that workplaces exist for the productive output of human beings and don't have any responsibility to care for the inputs that go into that.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? The concept of a duty of care for the people that you are working for you, because after all, you are providing their living experience for 8 hours a day or whatever it is. So having some kind of responsibility to try and create an experience that doesn't add to distress and so forth. You make it at 2 points. One is, which I think is very important, is that people can feel awkward around mental distress. It's like, when people, somebody who's died and are in great grief, and you worry to talk to them because you're not sure what to say. So there's a lot of anxiety around how do we deal with mental distress, because as a society we've constantly pushed it into the shadows, haven't we, really? And the other point you make is this distinction between the stresses that are really outside of the company and the stresses that are inside of the company, to do with working environments. Hot desking is the new thing, which is very stressful to people. There's quite a lot of data on that. And also bullying, where companies are really not addressing some of the key issues within the company that can support.
Right. Yes, lots of what we might just generously call poor behavior or bad behavior gets tolerated under the name of productivity or under the guise of talent. So it's not, in the instance of bullying, it's not unusual for me to hear conversations or to hear organizations describe that there's a certain member of a team or a certain leader in the organization that they know creates distress and creates suffering in their wake, and that is, who is bullying and harmful to people, but they're so talented that the organization can't live without them. And I think one of my colleagues in the Broad Academy, Bob Sutton, even wrote a book that you may know called The No Asshole Rule, if we can say that on a podcast. It's a book title. So
that's great. Sounds great.
But he saw it in such a widespread, excusing of human behavior that was atrocious in the businesses he was consulting with and in the the students going through the Stanford Business School, trying to start new organizations and so on, that he felt compelled to just dispel the myth that bullying leadership and tolerating toxicity in the name of talent is going to elevate the performance of your organization in any way, shape, or form. And so once again, we're often starting by talking about some of the key obstacles, like knowingly, right, aiding and abetting bullying in workplaces, because we broadly, right, we the people who work there, or the people who are entrusted with what to do, don't know what to do about it, don't know how to address it or change it. And the other thing is this inside and outside the organization where the distress originates. I think there's so much distress originating right within the conditions that workplaces create. And so bullying and uncivil behavior is one kind, burnout and irrational job expectations is another kind of distress that happens. And I've said this before many times, but I think it bears repeating, that often doing this kind of work, organizations will call up me or someone in your beautiful network of practitioners who know something about compassion, and they'll ask you to come in and teach a mindfulness class or run a compassion training. And if you dig into why they want to do that, sometimes they really want to honor a duty of care, but other times they are running short-staffed, or they have had a huge exodus of people, and they haven't been able to rehire quickly enough, or they performed a layoff or a downsizing or a set of firings in a particularly cruel way, and the people who weren't fired are in distress. And it's in those cases usually not helpful to just try to slap a mindfulness class over the top of those conditions. And so I think another thing that the research and the grounded kind of investigation of the sources of distress in organization have taught me is to look really carefully at what's creating the kinds of distress that an organization is trying to handle, and to not assume that there's any one-size-fits-all solution for creating a more compassionate organization.
I think that's such an important point you make, isn't it? Is looking to the structure, looking to the culture, looking to the internal processes of relationships. Those are such important points. And what's your take? The Me Too movement and all of that, which was starting to call out bullies and people who are exploitative. What about that in work? I mean, do you think that's increasing? That there's increasing movement in the, we can call it the individuals lower in the organization to be able to take on individuals higher up in the organization? Because that does seem to be an important issue within organizations, that the individuals, quote, lower, whatever that means, have some kind of power to call to account those that manage them.
Yes, I think that many organizations have ethics policies, and some have ethics hotlines, or ways that organizations can voice an ethical complaint without being identified. And that seems like a fine thing to have, and a necessary thing to have in the organization. But beyond that, few organizations think carefully about means of conflict resolution, and conflict resolution that's beyond the sanctioning and firing of employees. So universities are unusual in that most of them have something like an ombudsperson office or an office of conflict resolution where people know to go if they have a conflict within the organization and they have some mediation or relational help to address the issue. But few other kinds of organizations that I've come across have thought very creatively about inventing roles such as that, where someone is entrusted to know how to create a more generative, productive conversation in a conflictual space, and where they're thinking carefully about the kinds of remedies to harm that might be useful and valuable to the organization more broadly, not just to any one wounded or harmed party. So we need more creative thinking about the role ecology in an organization and roles that are entrusted with surfacing suffering, making it more discussable and helping people handle it in a variety of ways. And also the routines that get put into place when suffering of various kinds arises. So the kind of routine that would help someone who's dealing with a chronic illness, for instance, is an important kind of care and compassion routine to build into an organization, but it's very different than the kind of routine you need to handle someone who's really feeling bullied or at the mercy of a toxic leader.
Yes, yes, that's really, really important, isn't it, to have a portfolio of different compassion interventions for different kind of difficulties. I think that's such an important point. It really comes back again to the key thing you were saying right at the beginning, which is that, you know, compassion is quite a complicated state. It's not an easy state. It's not a one-size-fits-all. You have to do different things for different people. So, I mean, the issue then really is, do you think there is a movement in business, in industry, to gradually become more aware of a duty of care, to think about organizations a little bit more like family? Do you think that's gradually moving in the social discourse of things?
That the discourse is certainly changing. So yes, I think there are some gradual steps. And I think that many leaders now understand that other social institutions and the social structures to aid people are in decline. And so people bring more and more and more of the life needs that they have to work, as work also has become, in many cases, much more demanding. So many people work very long work days. The statistics for people who use email as a part of their work are pretty frightening when you look at them, right? 60 to 70% of people sleep with their smartphone in the bed or near the bed, and the first thing they do in the morning is look for email.
Wow.
So the work day it's not confined to any kind of work hours. With the changing work environments, many people now work from home as often or more often as they work from another location. So with the blending of childcare and food preparation and everything else that has to happen in a life with work, I think that the need for greater compassion and an ethic of care is becoming more of the discourse.
Yeah, now that's fascinating, isn't it? That everything is becoming sort of blended into one. There's not so much of a separation now between home life and work life. I'm fascinated by that statistic that 60-70% have their phones, so that's really interesting. So, but that also creates sort of difficulties in a way about how people are using their minds, in a sense, if they're using their minds mostly to fill their minds full of stuff and worries of work. That's terribly conducive to well-being, and they're not able to get separation and have a period of rest and, you know, set the day down or something.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that I think one of the fastest growing trends in the United States in relation to compassion training is to talk about self-compassion. And I think the reason for that, I'm all for it. We need to learn a lot about self-compassion here in the United States. But the reason behind that trend, it seems to me, is exactly this, that the organizations themselves are not really taking accountability in a deep way for how much they're intruding in people's lives when people work from home, when they bring their children to work meetings, when they check email from bed, when they take work, out to a performance or a party that they might be going to in the evening, and on the intermission, they answer the email, right? They're never away from it. And the organizations that are not taking deep accountability for this are making it the responsibility of each member of that organization to try to draw some boundary for themselves that makes sense. And people feel such pressure to be responsive all the time, or have very little capacity to mentally set work aside, even if they leave a setting where work happens, like in healthcare, for instance, was that the work and non-work boundary disappears, and we're putting the onus on the employee to figure out how to reestablish it by going to some self-compassion training, rather than the organizations taking deep accountability for trying to collectively reestablish some healthy boundaries.
That's such an important point, isn't it? That when there are problems, the solutions are constantly pushed onto the individual. You sort it out, even though the problem is actually not in their heads, it's in actually what they're experiencing, what they're taking in, the environment in which they're living and reacting to. The solution keeps put to them. So that's really an important point, isn't it?
And that's, I think, what Jane and I, in the work that we have published together and in writing Awakening Compassion at Work, that was one of the most important messages we wanted to give to organizations and people who lead organizations or who think about the human aspects of organizing, is that the kind of individualism that's at the heart of a country like the United States, and then the methodological individualism of social science, where we don't get trained very much, unless we're really good sociologists, to think about collectives and the life and the power of collectives, combines to create a lot of very individualistic answers to problems that are much more systemic. And I notice when I do teaching that it's easier for people to think about, they're more familiar with thinking about individual remedies, but the systemic conditions of work that are causing the distress have to be tackled to really alleviate the distress in a full societal manner. And so we like to try to talk to people about thinking about activating the social networks in a system through care, right? And thinking about using communication mechanisms and symbolic vehicles and rituals to reinforce an ethic of care, or the duty to care. And then to think about any routinized tasks that are created in an organization as related to the creation of compassion. So it's never, right, it's never the case that anything that we do in a work organization doesn't have something to do with compassion. And that's often a switch that if I'm a successful teacher, I can help people flip that switch. And suddenly you think, oh, the way we hire people has a lot to do with what they think they're coming to and how they're beginning their journey here. So that has a lot to do with whether we get compassion, on when they come through the door. We're like, oh, the way that we evaluate people's performance can be punitive and draconian, or it can be conversational and understanding, right? It can be one-sided or relational, and that will have a lot to do with how much we know about the conditions of one another's work and how we think about gaps in performance. Or our attendance policy. If people have to clock in at a certain minute, what we have learned in our research is that for single mothers and for people with less economic means and people that rely on public transit, a clock-in system that punishes you if you're just a minute or two late can make it impossible for them to receive bonuses or awards, or sometimes even to continue working. Whereas if they just had a slight bit of flexibility, that if the bus is a few minutes late, they're still on time for work, that they can become much more at ease, and they become better contributors in the organization. And people very, very rarely start off thinking, oh, it's my time clock system that's going to make a more compassionate organization. But in fact, anything that the organization is doing from a policy or a practice perspective can be considered about how it exacerbates or alleviates distress for people.
That's such an important point, isn't it? I mean, it's an overhang from the centuries gone where we used to have to clock into the factories and so forth. One of the things I think is very important, what you're saying, is also that when you have a clock-in system, it's basically saying we don't trust you. That unless you can prove that you're there, we don't trust you to do the work. And that in itself is an undermining. Whereas without a clock-in system, we trust you to come in and do what you need to do in the hours that you need to do. And so those issues are really such an important, they seem quite small, but actually from what you're saying, they're quite fundamental, aren't they, really?
Yes, they are. And so, that's another reason why we have to maintain our healthy, appreciative, critical eye on the conditions of work when we talk about compassion, because the fundamental conditions of management are of distrust, right? Like people, can't be counted on to do what we need them to do. So we create a role to oversee that they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? And there's a kind of, it's just in thinking about the theory of bureaucracy, there's a kind of fundamental dehumanizing that happens when we put people into hierarchically based roles that try to erase some of their humanness, right? And we try to make them into replaceable cogs in the wheel, to use Weber's metaphor. And that's, that's the way that most of us, whether we're formally or not trained to think about work. It's the inherited, cultural view of organizations that we're cogs in the wheel. And when push comes to shove, we better do our cog part in the wheel.
Yes, that's such an important thing. And the other thing you were saying, which take you up on, which I think is quite important, this issue of self-compassion. I mean, in our view, as we have the flow, because compassion to others is very important. And having organizations and people in an office or wherever understand that their compassion to each other is going to be really important, how to engage in listening and how to take an interest in the people around you. Just practicing simple sort of empathy skills really can make quite a big difference. When people, that's actually part of what you're doing, taking interest in each other. One compassionate action every day for each person, blah, blah, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But also the ability to be open to compassion, because one of the problems with self-compassion is it turns you slightly away from the fact that actually what you probably need to do is to go and get help, that this is not
Yes,
something you can sort out yourself or
that's
whatever.
right.
And that ability to trust others, so it's not all about what I do, what I do, what I do, is actually how can I not feel ashamed so that I can turn to others for help.
Yes. Yes, I think that's part of what I'm hopeful about, since I've talked a lot about what I'm not hopeful about. Part of what I'm hopeful about is that the scope and scale of issues of burnout and issues of bullying that are so widespread now that no one can ignore them, but that makes it very apparent that all of us need help. And the organizations that where we work are a big part of the source that of where the help should come from. So if we have more flexible time structures, if we have more negotiable demands, if we have the capacity to engage in renewing conversations, but if there are ways that we can feel safe reporting exploitative behavior. But these kinds of things are on the discussion docket now for anyone who's learning about leadership in a way that they weren't before. And I do think that is hopeful, but that it takes it away from being just an individual issue, but it also moves locuses of help into places where people could more easily access them.
Yes, of course, some of that's been partly to do with you and Jane and your colleagues who have been promoting that very much at work, so who got you to thank for that. One of the things that I'm also interested in is, as you know, a lot of my research has been on power and subordination and inferiority and defeat states and depression and stuff like that. That when we became hunter-gatherers, one of the things that we did in the shifting from primate dominant males, because they cause a lot of the trouble really, these dominant aggressive males, was that the subordinates started to gang up against them. And hunter-gatherer society partly grew out of this changing in the way the subordinates began to operate as a group, so that dominant individuals could not start doing their stuff because they were kicked out. And that gradually filtered through, and over a few million years that has become, that's what we're adapted for, isn't it? Hunter-gatherer society is really that egalitarian way of being. So that's what I'm interested in business, is whether there's ways in which we can help people recognize that these ways of joint sharing and caring with each other, actually you'll get more that way, rather than controlling and holding, trying to forcing and checking. But this ability, because people also want to feel valued, they want to feel they make a contribution, that they have meaning in what they're doing. So do you see those sorts of psychologies, the psychology of getting a much more caring, sharing organization coming? Do you see that as a possibility, a more hunter-gatherer lifestyle in the firm?
I do see it as a possibility, and I think that many of these large organizations understand that the command and control hierarchy is a kind of a mythical thing that maybe used to exist or maybe not, but that the way that work happens now is in a decentralized, organic systems, that deeply cooperative groups work better than non-cooperative groups, and that in fact better quality work and even more productive work comes when you have a base of what you call caring and sharing. And I think that turn is happening.
I mean, that is what is heartening to me, I think. I mean, I tend to feel that that's, again, this more cooperative way of working where people are mutually supportive of each other. That's so important because, as you know, one of the problems that's haunted humanity and still haunts humanity is the way these dominant aggressive males get into power, and then they cause absolute havoc. I mean, Putin is one, but they're all over the world, really, and they have been for thousands of years, and you get them in business and they're absolute nightmare. They're so poisonous. And trying to find ways to empower those who are infected by them to kind of get rid of them. That's how do we do that within how we do politics in the world is an important thing,
Yes.
but how we do that within organizations, I think, how we bring the power to those who are the victims of abuse, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I have a good answer for the overthrow to happen. But one thing that has long interested me, though, is that very early on in this work, when we were having people who had access to the research and were interested in it and wanted to understand how it applied in their work organization, most of those people were the hunter-gatherers, right? They weren't the alpha male dominant types. And they had, what I learned really quickly is that they had a tremendous capacity to influence what was going on in their little part of the organizational world. And that they were often themselves or someone else nearby in the organization could often serve as a buffer between the chaotic antics created by a few people that get a lot of media attention, right? And the daily lived experience of what it was like to actually work in this place. And so I think that, I've spent the majority of my time talking about compassion and work, not compassion and leadership. And I've made that decision consciously on purpose because I think that much of the change in the actual quality of people's daily lived work experience doesn't happen through the work of people we typically think of as leaders. It happens in people who are interested in creating a better daily work environment for the people that they have some capacity to influence, or for the budget that they control. And it may be a small piece of a large budget, but they have decision-making authority and they want to invest in people in the way that they can. And I think that, that has been my theory of change for a long time. It's a kind of, I guess it's benign neglect of the antics of the ape that gets way too much of our attention and determined focus on the rest of the troop who are busy cooperating with each other.
That's brilliant. I think that's so wonderful. Absolutely. I mean, that is a pretty novel, unique focus, isn't it?
Yes. It's not the kind of change program that you would find if you went and hired, say, one of the big consulting firms that wanted to tell you how to change your business into a compassionate business, because they will usually, as we already discussed, start with an outdated hierarchical model, or they may have a top-down and bottom, what they call a top-down and bottom-up change model, which still preserves essentially the hierarchical mental model, just says, well, some people can influence up the hierarchy, right? But if we set aside as much as possible that as a kind of received, inherited cultural myth, or an old way of thinking about organizing, and we embrace a more living, organic system that unfolds across people who are tied in these loosely coupled and tightly coupled structures. And we say, how can we turn the ties between people to be more filled with empathy and care for one another's human state? Right? And as we influence that network of ties between the people who we can see are tied together, right? Can we get them to think a little bit differently about what their role is supposed to be, right? So in my work as a professor, am I supposed to love my students? Am I supposed to care about how they are as human beings? Am I supposed to want them to grow? Or am I supposed to evaluate their work and know next to nothing about them? Right. And that just for any role that anyone is doing, we can, as we think about tying them into a network where care matters, we can get them to think about, well, how in my responsibility set am I doing care? Right. And so then you have what we call the jargony word for that is a role intervention coupled with a network intervention. And you start to really see some changing dynamics in this organic evolving system that the leaders have no idea is what, the people designated and labeled as leaders may have no idea this is going on. And it's, it's not necessary, and sometimes it's even better that they aren't involved because they may get scared and squash it.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. That's amazing. And that's such an important point that you're making, trying to get the organizations to work or get human relationships to work in the way that we were evolved to work, which is in these mutually supportive groups, really. I mean, that's what our brain, that's what we like best, when we feel we're supporting others and others feel supporting us, and we feel valued and they feel valued. That's when it all works pretty good.
Yeah.
So that's amazing to hear that. And my brother actually is doing some work in higher education, looking at exactly that, how to get the students to work together in their seminar groups so that they're not sort of competing with each other, but they take a mutual interest in each other. So what, as we're coming to the end now, what are you started to talk about what you're hoping for. So what are you hoping for over the next years?
Well, I'm hoping for and really engaged in working on creating more examples of what it looks like when this kind of organization that you and I have been talking about, all right, what does it look like in people's daily life experience? And what would it look like if I'm on a team of nurses? What would it look like if I'm in a team of teachers? What would it look like if I'm in a group of students? What would it look like if I'm in the technology sector, or if I'm in the hospitality sector? And I think that we're so bereft of examples that make us, that would open our eyes to the possibilities of ways of organizing that are different, and models of caring for one another as we do work that are beautiful. And when I ask my students to imagine differently, right? Like imagine a workplace full of compassion, they almost can't imagine it. And so I am thinking a lot about these, what I call these flexible social structures. Right? They're flexible because at the level of relational interaction, we can enact them in a way that suits us. But they're structural because they're carried in the collective and they're built into the consistency of the collective over time. So networks are flexible social structures. Roles are flexible social structures. It's partly how I enact it, but it's also carried in the collective body. And I'm trying to help people see networks, roles, routines, and culture as these flexible social structures, and that how we flex them right? Even among a small group of us, can really radically change the conditions of our work. And it generates examples and energy and exuberance that also travels, right? Because networks are connected to networks, right? That impetus for change, the ideas about how to do it, the enthusiasm for embracing it also travel through the network. And so I think there's a whole body of work about explicating the theory of this, but I'm also much more, I'm doing that, but I'm much more excited actually about getting the vivid live examples of what it's like and how it actually can work and be possible, because I think we so desperately need them. And we don't, the mainstream media is just going to feed us more Elon Musk, Silicon Valley Bank, Donald Trump stories, right? It's going to focus on the one outlier, right? Prominent, usually male person in power who is creating a lot of problems. And that habituates us to think that that's the only option available.
That's brilliant, actually. So it's not just about changing the leaders, you're kind of changing the soil in which they're standing, changing the culture in which this is all happening. So I think that's extraordinary. And are you working on case studies now, or how are you kind of doing the work?
Yeah, I'm working on small case examples, but I think that I would really like to find a way to do more crowdsourced, open sourced video examples, because I think so few people are reading nowadays, and case studies collected in books are few of us who cherish them still read them. So I've been really trying to think about and learn from people who do this well, to create a way where we could get more vivid stories and more life affirming, but really grounded windows into people's work. And that I think those would travel, those case studies would travel. So there's a scholar named Warren Nilsson, who's an organizational sociologist, who has studied how institutions that typically didn't change changed. And he works with a partner named Tana Paddock, and they've created this thing called Organization Unbound. And they inspire me a lot. They help people understand that if you're wanting to create peace out there, you'd better be able to create peace in here. Right? If you want to be able to create compassion for people coming to your door, right, just coming to your shop or your hospital, you better be able to create compassion in the shop, right, or in the hospital. And they've been using video case studies of groups and organizations that are really working to creatively change the conditions of work in the workplace in order to accomplish a mission like peace building or compassion building outside of the organization as well.
That's incredible. That's so exciting.
Yeah, they're very good storytellers, and they do a really good job of creating these rich, vivid video examples of how these organizations do this.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. Yeah, and it was interesting. I don't know if you've heard of something called the Schwartz rounds, but actually
Yes.
began in America for nurses. So they give them an opportunity to actually share their own feelings towards their patients, because they often don't get a chance to talk about what they're feeling about nursing people who are dying or whatever. So bringing in these kinds of experiences within organizations for people to share their feelings, share their difficulties, I think they're all such an important part of the jigsaw of how you create this compassionate organization. So we're coming to the end. Are there any things that you would like to kind of focus on before we finish for the evening?
I just would like to say thank you to you, and formally. I think I've said it in private, hopefully many times, but I think the work that you have done over many years to create this conversation has been such a source of inspiration to me and so many others that I know and work with every day. And I have learned so much from reading your writing and from every time we've had a chance to have a brief conversation or to be in the same space. So I feel like I continually learn from you and the amazing network of people that you have created in the world who are carrying the work into new spaces inspires me greatly. And I just, it's such a pleasure to have this conversation with you, because I feel like I've learned so much of how to have the conversation from you.
Well, I have to say, it's been a very inspiring conversation for me, and I've learned quite a lot today, particularly the last sort of half of the interview where you were talking about these new ways. Don't worry so much about, you're not saying don't worry at all, but not worry so much about leadership, and think about the organization as an organic, growing, interacting set of, I think that's wonderful, actually. I hadn't really heard it articulated quite like you have this evening, so that's a very inspiring way of thinking, because I love all that stuff, creating these egalitarian, mutually supportive communities within work. I think it's just wonderful.
Yes.
Okay, well, look, the last question is, if people want to get involved with your work and find out more about what you're doing, we will put your website link up at the end, but is there anything that you would like to say to people about how they might get more involved with this compassion movement at work?
Well, they could read Awakening Compassion at Work by Jane and I. It's getting a bit old now, but it's not going out of style anytime soon, I can tell you.
Yes.
And we do some teaching and training and keynote talks and things like that. We run them through this idea incubator you mentioned called Enliven Work. And so that's the place to go to reach us if you want us to help you think about weaving these ideas into your organization in some way. Brilliant,
absolutely brilliant. And I'm hoping there'll be quite a lot of takers to do that, because it is such a unique, I think, and really great way of thinking about organizations. Monica, thank you so much. You've been an absolute delight, and I've learned a lot this evening. So we just wish you best, and maybe we'll chat again in a year's time, see how you're doing. But for now, thank you so much.
Thank you. I look forward to it.